This week, we're looking at two wars, war in Korea and war in Vietnam. Now, both these wars are related to this idea of communism and the spread of communism in Asia. Our objectives. First, trace the course and consequences of the Korean War. Second, summarize the causes of the Vietnam War and describe its aftermath. Third, describe conditions in Cambodia and Vietnam after the Vietnam War. So first we're looking at war in Korea. This happened before the Vietnam War. It started in 1950. Now, if we remember, World War II has just ended and the 50s come along and we're starting to see the Cold War happening. So we have the spread of communism and we have America trying to stop the spread of communism. So at this moment, we have a line that is dividing Korea, and this is called the 38th parallel. It divides Korea into the northern part and the southern part. Now, when World War II ended, the Japanese surrendered North Korea to the Soviets, and they surrendered South Korea to the Americans. So that is why we have this division of North and South Korea. What ends up happening, though, is when Japan leaves, we again see the spread of communism in the north. This, of course, leads to the establishment of communism in North Korea with the dictator Kim Il-sung. He is put there as sort of the communist dictator, while in the south we have Syngman Rhee, who was backed by the US and who was promoting democracy. Now, the Soviets, they sort of believed that the US wasn't going to back up South Korea, and they saw that many of the American troops were leaving South Korea. So they took this as a chance to try and take over South Korea. So in 1950, we have North Korea ends up overrunning South Korea with the help of the Soviets. So as you can see on this first map here, the red area, this is all controlled by the North in 1950. The only area that is still controlled by the south is a small area, green area near Busan. Americans do respond. What ends up happening is we have the UN gets involved, and the UN, they start to support South Korea with lots of troops. And the troops leader is Douglas MacArthur. Now, if you don't remember who Douglas MacArthur is, he fought in World War II, and he was the one who came up with the idea of island hopping in the Pacific. So Douglas MacArthur, he is leading another charge in South Korea. Now the UN, they are able to fight against North Korea, and they push North Korea's border back again. So in the same year, in 1950, in October and November, we see the UN troops have landed, helping South Korea push back North Korea's border all the way here, okay? So again, we have the UN advancing northwards. But as you can see, this is getting awfully close to China. China does not like it that the UN has sort of taken over North Korea. So China ends up sending in troops to help the North Koreans. And within the same year, we see that North Korea is able to push back again past Seoul. So by the 1951, we see that South Korea has sort of lost a lot of what they have gained. Seoul is ended up captured, and all the UN gains were lost. Now, when China gets involved and pushed back, we have MacArthur is quite upset about this, and he is wanting to start a nuclear attack on North Korea. He actually goes over President Truman's head. He goes straight to the Congress, straight to the UN to try and discuss this idea of nuclear war. Even after Truman had said, no, we're not going to do this. So when he does that, he gets removed. So we no longer have MacArthur in command in the Korean War. In 1953, we have a ceasefire is signed, and that is the border, and it's established at the 38th parallel. So this is what North and South Korea look like today. So this was quite a short war. It only lasted 3 years. We have troops remaining on either side of the demilitarized zone. So the 38th parallel, this is a demilitarized zone, which means there's no military there. It's sort of the peaceful zone. So as soon as the fighting stops, we have North Korea and their dictator Kim Il-sung. He ends up building tons of collective farms. He amps up industry in North Korea, and he, of course, makes a lot of nuclear weapons. This is sort of following the Soviet Union model of communism. In South Korea, we have democracy. We also have a growing economy and trade with the US. And the US ends up bringing a lot of aid to South Korea to ensure that the North Korea will not take it over again. So your first question of the week is, discuss the aftermath of the Korean War. Here are also two graphs to sort of also add to that question of the aftermath of the Korean War. So as you can see here, the south is the dotted line. We can see that the annual GDP is going up every year, whereas North Korea stays pretty much the same. Here's another graph, again with the GDP. Again, we see South Korea's economy is increasing, while North Korea's hardly increases at all. So as we see with the Korean War, we have the US practicing this idea of containment again. Containment meaning they want to keep communism in the Soviet Union. They don't want it to spread. Well, we see that again when we look at Vietnam. So we're going to have another war breaking out in Vietnam. This war actually starts with France, but sort of is taken over by the US in the 60s. Communism in Vietnam all starts with this man. This man, his name is Ho Chi Minh. So Ho Chi Minh actually was living in France after World War I, and he returns to Vietnam and he sort of learned a lot about this idea of communism that's starting to spread. Now, to be clear, this is before World War II. So when Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam, he starts sort of a Vietnamese nationalist and later a communist group. And those nationalist groups, they lead revolts against the French. So at this time, if we look back on this map, we see that France has taken over Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. These are part of French colonies. Well, Ho Chi Minh is starting to think that this is not right. This should not be owned by France. So he starts these revolts against France. Ho Chi Minh is actually supposed to be put to death by the French people in Vietnam. But instead, World War II ends up breaking out and the Japanese take over Vietnam. So his death is sort of put on hold. Afterwards, after World War II and the Japanese leave Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh believes that Vietnam is going to have their independence. But the French have sort of different plans. They want to take Vietnam back. Ho Chi Minh ends up sort of fighting back against the French after World War II in 1954. And the French, they basically start giving up in Vietnam. They don't believe that it is worth all the money and the struggle to keep Vietnam as a colony. And they also have a major defeat at Dien Bien Phu. And that sort of marks the end of France control in Vietnam. Well, immediately we see that Ho Chi Minh has a very communist sort of manifesto for Vietnam. And this starts to worry the Americans. And President Eisenhower ends up coining a term called the domino theory. They basically believe that if one Southeast Asian country were to fall to communism, that all the other Southeast Asian countries would follow. And this is the reason why the US wanted to get involved. Now remember, the US's policy was containment. They wanted to contain communism to Soviet Union. They did not want it to spread. This is why the US gets involved. Vietnam ends up being divided, much like South Korea was divided. We have the demilitarized zone right here in the middle. And in the north, we have Ho Chi Minh. He has taken over the northern part of Vietnam. And in the south, we have Ninh Dinh Diem. He is sort of a puppet of US and French government. Now, it's to be clear that Diem was a dictator. So the man in the South who was ruling the South, he did not really implement democracy, which is what French and America sort of stood for. He ruled with absolute power. And he ends up sort of being a very disliked leader in the South. And what starts to form is the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong, these are Southern Vietnamese communists who are guerrilla fighters. Guerrilla fighters mean they sort of surprise attack their enemy using sort of the landscape to their benefit. We start to see many of these guerrillas fighting against Diem. And many of Diem's policies, he's very disliked. And so many of the Viet Cong, they start to grow. Now it's clear that some people from the north are a part of the Viet Cong and they're sort of training Southern Vietnamese. But most of the people were Southern Vietnamese who didn't like Diem. Here is actually a footage of a Buddhist monk protesting against Diem in Hue. So this is quite a dramatic photo. When the US realizes that at this point, Northern communists and Ho Chi Minh are going to be taking over the South, they decide to get more involved. Now the first event happens in the Gulf of Tonkin. This is in the northern bay near Hanoi. The US claimed that Northern Vietnamese attacked 2 US destroyers' ships. So the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, he ends up asking Congress to start war with North Vietnam. They saw the attack of North Vietnamese attacking U.S. ships as a threat to America. And here we have Johnson saying, Congress approves to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. So the U.S. troops enter. And they slowly increase the amount of soldiers every year. But the US is faced with some problems. First of all, they are fighting a guerrilla war. A guerrilla war is sort of this hide and surprise attack the enemy. And they're fighting it in a land that they didn't know. The US is not familiar with the jungles of Vietnam. The second thing is that the US is defending a dictator in the South who is growing unpopular. The people don't like Diem. The second thing is that the Viet Cong, they are supported by Ho Chi Minh in the North, by China and the Soviet Union who want to spread communism to Vietnam. So again, the elusive enemy. There's guerrilla warfare. They don't have direct war. Many of the attacks are sort of hit and run. And many of the peasants, they end up starting to support these guerrilla warfares because of how the US reacts. The second thing, there's a hidden network of tunnels both outside of Hue, which is in the middle near the demilitarized zone, and outside of Saigon. And they're connected to villages. The Viet Cong has also set up many sort of landmines, and they ambush the American enemies. Here an example of some of the tunnels of the Viet Cong. So if you can say they're all living underground, which makes it very hard for the US to find and able to bomb. Here's an example of some of the soldiers who are walking through the sort of jungle terrain of Vietnam. As you can see, many of these soldiers were not properly equipped. The way that the US ends up dealing with the Vietnam War is they end up bombing. Here we have many village children running away from their hometown that has just been bombed by American soldiers. In 1968, we have the Viet Cong. They begin what we call the Tet Offense. This is hundreds of attacks in southern Vietnam. So the Viet Cong, they launch surprise attacks. The US and southern Vietnams, they actually regain control. And this is a victory for the US. But this victory sort of comes at a cost. More and more people in the US start to oppose this war. They're against it. And the reason why is because the US's use of bombs and Agent Orange. So by 1969, we have the American president, Richard Nixon. He starts to withdraw troops from Vietnam. This is called Vietnamization. So his plan is to slowly and gradually remove troops, and the last troops leave in 1973. But the result is that we have Saigon ends up falling to North Vietnam.